The Fall of an Empire. It's August 15th, 1947. You stand among a crowd in Delhi as the Union Jack is lowered for the final time. After nearly 2 centuries of domination, Britain's rule over India, the shining jewel of its empire, has come to an abrupt end, not because of compassion, not because of a sudden moral awakening, but because Britain was broke world. War II had gutted its economy, national debt had exploded to over 200% of GDP, the treasury was empty, and without India's wealth to drain, there was no way to finance the empire anymore. Here's what few people realize. India's independence wasn't a gift, it was a financial surrender. The British Empire didn't grant freedom. It simply could no longer afford to hold on. And when India slipped away, the entire imperial system began to collapse. The rise of greed. To understand how this empire fell, you have to go back to where it all began. December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth. I signs a royal charter granting a group of English merchants exclusive trading rights across Asia. It was called the East India Company, and it would become the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. At first, it looked harmless, trading spices, textiles, and tea. But soon, this company began operating like a nation-state. By the 18th century, it commanded a private army of 260,000 men, twice the size of Britain's own. Military, a corporation with its own army, its own currency, its own empire. The turning point came in 1757 in the Battle of Plassey. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal, the company was granted the Diwani, the right to collect taxes across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. That meant control over 30 million people and one of the richest regions on earth. In just a few years, the East India Company shifted from merchant to monarch, ruling, taxing, and exploiting at will. The cost of empire. They monopolized salt, tobacco, and opium, forced Indian artisans to sell at prices 40% below market value. Weavers, who had once created the world's finest fabrics, were reduced to bonded laborers. Then came the Bengal Famine of 1769 to 1770. Between 7 and 10 million people perished. While the company continued to collect taxes as usual, they literally taxed people to death. This wasn't a failure of policy, it was the policy. By 1750, India made up a quarter of global industrial output. By 1900, that number had collapsed to just 2%. Why? Because Britain didn't just conquer India, it deindustrialized it. Indian markets were flooded with British goods, sold tariff-free, while Indian producers were crushed under heavy taxes. British factories bought India's raw cotton for almost nothing, spun it into textiles, and sold those same goods back to India. Profit guaranteed. Competition destroyed. Between 1850 and 1896, textile imports from Britain soared from 5 million to 18 million. India's legendary weavers were wiped out. Between 1600 and 1871, India's GDP per capita fell from over 60% of Britain's to less than 15%. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it made Britain rich beyond imagination. Then came the next level of corruption, the opium trade. The East India Company became the world's largest drug dealer, forcing Indian farmers to grow opium for export to China in exchange for silver and tea. When China resisted this addiction, Britain declared war and won. The Opium Wars turned Britain's moral hypocrisy into global policy. By the mid-1800s, India had become the empire's plantation and its victim. In 1857, Indian soldiers of the East India Company's own army rose in revolt, one of the greatest uprisings in colonial history. But Britain crushed it brutally, and then sent India the bill. The cost of suppressing the rebellion was charged entirely to Indian taxpayers. They paid for their own defeat. After that, the British Crown took direct control, dissolving the company but expanding its extraction. Half of India's revenue went straight into maintaining the empire's military machine. Even the railways, often called Britain's gift to India, were built on Indian debt. Between 1860 and 1890, India's rail network expanded from 1,300 to 25,000 kilometers, but every contract required British-made equipment. So India borrowed the money, paid for construction, and Britain pocketed the profits. Economist Dadabhai Nauroji called it the drain of wealth. He calculated that Britain extracted up to $40 million a year from India, while reinvesting less than $250,000. He called it vampirism, and he was right, because when wealth leaves a nation and never returns, that nation bleeds, the empire bleeds out. By World War I, more than 1 million Indian soldiers had fought for Britain across every major front. From France to Mesopotamia, over 150,000 were killed or wounded, and India still paid most of the cost itself. By World War II, the numbers became catastrophic. The British Indian Army swelled to 3.3 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. Britain financed its war effort by issuing IOUs called sterling balances, massive debts owed to India. By 1945, India had become Britain's biggest creditor, and then came the Bengal Famine of 1943, a man-made disaster that killed between 800,000 and 3.8 million people. While India starved, Britain diverted food to Europe. When told about the famine, Winston Churchill coldly remarked, "Indians must learn to look after themselves." He even suggested that India should pay Britain for its own defense, using starvation as leverage to erase debt. By the end of the war, Britain was broken. Its debt was twice the size of its economy. Exports had collapsed. The empire was bankrupt. The United States stepped in with a $375 billion loan, and Canada with another $1.9 billion. Britain wouldn't finish repaying them until but the empire itself was finished. Without India's wealth, the global machine couldn't run. On June 3, 1947, Britain announced its withdrawal. By August 15th, the flag came down. It wasn't a gesture of grace. It was a retreat of desperation, history's echo. In 1700, India made up 27% of global GDP. By 1947, just 4%. Meanwhile, Britain's share had risen from 3% to 9%. For 200 years, Britain's rise was India's decline, and when the drain stopped, so did the empire. After independence, India began to rebuild. In 1947, the average life expectancy was just 27 years. By the turn of the century, it had more than doubled. In a few decades of self-rule, India achieved what 190 years of British development never did. Britain may have won the war, but it lost its empire. The Commonwealth replaced the colonies, and by the 1960s, most of its territories were gone. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet had dissolved into history, but history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. Today, the United States stands where Britain once stood, a global superpower with 750 overseas bases, trillions in war debt, and a financial system stretched thin. Britain's power was built on colonial extraction. America's depends on the dollar's supremacy, global trade, and military reach enforcing it. But when debt piles up and the cost of empire outweighs the returns, decline begins. Just as Britain's control collapsed when India slipped away, America could face its own reckoning when the dollar loses its global grip. Britain's debt reached 200% of GDP by 1945. America's today isn't far off. History has already shown what happens. Empires don't fall in a day. They bleed out slowly. Through arrogance, overspending, and the illusion that power lasts forever. The British Empire's trillion-dollar mistake wasn't just financial, it was moral, believing you could drain the world forever without consequence. And when the bill finally came due, the sun that once never set on the British Empire finally did.